Republicans in the Senate have shut down a resolution that would have placed limits on President Trump's authority to take military action in Venezuela. But that final outcome hides just how close Trump came to a humiliating defeat at the hands of his own party. Just days earlier, 5 Republican senators broke ranks and joined Democrats to advance a war powers measure designed to restrict Trump's ability to escalate or expand military operations without explicit congressional approval. That vote sent shockwaves through Washington and triggered panic inside the White House. The concern driving the resolution was straightforward and serious. Lawmakers in both parties were increasingly alarmed by the possibility that President Trump could order U.S. ground troops into Venezuela without congressional authorization. Under the Constitution, Congress holds the power to declare war. Under the War Powers Resolution, presidents must seek approval for sustained military action. Yet Trump had already launched strikes, overseen the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, and openly discussed reshaping Venezuela's government, all without Congress signing off. One of the Republicans who initially voted to advance the resolution was Missouri Senator Josh Hawley. Speaking before the final vote, Hawley explained why he ultimately changed his position. He said he had engaged in multiple substantive conversations with administration officials over the previous 5 days. According to Hawley, the White House repeatedly argued that the resolution would unnecessarily restrict the president's flexibility. Hawley said he pushed back by raising his core concern: the possibility of U.S. ground troops being deployed into Venezuela without Congress authorizing it. Administration officials, he said, assured him that there were no plans for such a deployment, and that assurance ultimately persuaded him to flip his vote. At the same time, Democrats were advancing other accountability efforts elsewhere in government, including a push aimed at leadership at the Department of Homeland Security. One Democratic lawmaker said she had already secured more than 70 co-sponsors for a measure focused on accountability, arguing that DHS leadership had failed in its responsibilities and should step aside. The department rejected those claims, stating that DHS was simply enforcing laws passed by Congress and carrying out its mission as a law enforcement agency. With Republicans holding the majority, however, it was always unclear whether any of those efforts would gain real traction. Speaker Mike Johnson quickly condemned what he described as political attacks, signaling that GOP leadership intended to shut them down. Then came the moment that truly mattered. The Senate delivered what can only be described as a massive rebuke to President Trump. And when we say massive, we mean historic. A bipartisan majority of the Senate voted against Trump's position on Venezuela. 5 Republicans crossed party lines to side with Democrats and moved to limit Trump's war powers. That is not symbolic. That is not routine. That is a direct challenge to presidential authority from the president's own party, and Trump absolutely lost it. Here's what happened next and why it rattled the White House so badly. On January 8, 2026, the Senate voted 52-47 to advance the War Powers Resolution aimed at curbing Trump's ability to expand military action in Venezuela without congressional authorization. That number matters. 52 senators voted yes, 47 voted no. That means a clear bipartisan majority of the United States Senate voted to tell the president, no, you do not get to do this alone. All 47 Democrats voted in favor of advancing the resolution. That part was expected. What made the vote explosive was the fact that 5 Republicans joined them. Those Republicans were Rand Paul of Kentucky, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Josh Hawley of Missouri, and Todd Young of Indiana. 5 Republican senators publicly broke with Trump on one of the most serious powers a president can exercise, the power to take the country to war. That is not a small disagreement. That is a fundamental challenge, and it immediately exposed cracks in Republican unity that Trump and GOP leadership had worked hard to keep hidden. Trump's grip on the Senate suddenly looked a lot weaker than he wanted people to believe, and his response made that weakness even more obvious. Trump erupted. He went straight to his social media platform and blasted the 5 Republican senators by name. He accused them of undermining American self-defense. He said they should be ashamed of themselves. He declared that they should never be elected to public office again. He claimed the vote severely hampered the president's authority as commander-in-chief. It was not measured, it was not restrained, it was a full-scale meltdown. Think about what that means. A sitting president publicly attacking members of his own party because they exercised Congress's constitutional authority over war powers. That is not normal behavior. That is not confidence. That is panic. That is a president who cannot tolerate even limited resistance, especially when it comes from his own side. Behind the scenes, the White House was furious. Reports described advisors scrambling to contain the damage and prevent a full-blown defeat on the final vote. Trump's team immediately launched an aggressive pressure campaign aimed at flipping votes before the resolution came up for final passage. Phone calls were made, political pressure was applied, promises were hinted at, consequences were implied, and just barely the pressure campaign worked. When the final vote was held, Senators Hawley and Young flipped their positions and voted with Trump. The result was a 50-50 tie. Vice President J.D. Vance stepped in and cast the tie-breaking vote to kill the resolution. Trump survived, technically, but that technical survival came at a cost. Trump needed an emergency pressure campaign and a vice presidential tiebreaker to avoid defeat. If just one more Republican had stood firm, Trump would have lost. One vote. That is how close the Senate came to formally limiting Trump's war powers over Venezuela. That would have been a historic humiliation for a sitting president. And even though Trump escaped, the damage was already done. Even though the resolution failed on the final vote, the earlier 52-47 rebuke still stands. 5 Republicans still went on record voting to advance a measure designed to limit Trump's authority. That vote is permanent. It is part of the congressional record. It cannot be erased. And it shows unmistakably that Trump's control over Senate Republicans is no longer absolute. This is wild, absolutely wild. To understand why this matters so much, you have to look at what prompted the resolution in the first place. Trump's Venezuela operation was controversial from the start. Without seeking congressional authorization, Trump launched military strikes, oversaw the capture of Nicolas Maduro, and openly discussed reshaping Venezuela's political future. He talked about running Venezuela as if it were a U.S. protectorate. And he did all of this without Congress approving the use of force. That set off alarm bells across Capitol Hill. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution exists specifically to prevent presidents from launching prolonged military operations on their own. Trump bypassed those guardrails entirely. Democrats and a handful of Republicans looked at that and said, "This is not how this works." So Democrats introduced a War Powers Resolution aimed squarely at Venezuela. The goal was simple: prevent Trump from continuing or expanding military action without explicit congressional authorization. When the Senate voted to advance that resolution, it wasn't a stunt. It was Congress asserting its role, and 5 Republicans agreed. Rand Paul has long opposed unchecked executive power and foreign interventions. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are moderates with histories of breaking from party leadership, but Josh Hawley and Todd Young were the real shockers. Hawley is often aligned with Trump and popular with the MAGA base. Young represents a state Trump won comfortably. Their votes sent a clear signal that Trump had crossed a line even within his own party. Despite intense pressure from GOP leadership and the White House, those 5 senators voted with Democrats anyway. That tells you how serious their concerns were. These were not symbolic gestures. These were calculated risks taken by senators who believed Trump's actions demanded congressional limits. Trump's response only reinforced that concern. Instead of engaging with the substance of the argument, Trump lashed out personally. He treated any limit on his power as a betrayal. He framed constitutional oversight as an attack on national security. That reaction should alarm anyone who cares about checks and balances. And then came the pressure campaign. The administration focused its efforts on Hawley and Young, believing they were more vulnerable to political pressure. Paul, Collins, and Murkowski have built reputations for independence. They are harder to intimidate. Hawley and Young, however, still rely heavily on party support and Trump's base. The pressure worked just enough to save Trump in the moment. But the fact that 3 Republicans still stood firm is what really matters going forward. It proves that defying Trump is possible. It proves that his threats are not always decisive. And it gives other Republicans a roadmap for future defections. This vote was about far more than Venezuela. It was about Trump's political strength, or lack thereof. The fact that 5 Republicans broke with him at all is extraordinary. Senate Republicans almost never publicly rebuke a president from their own party on an issue as consequential as war powers. The instinct is always to protect the president, to close ranks, to avoid airing disagreements in public. That instinct failed here. These senators decided the issue was serious enough to justify defying Trump, even knowing it would provoke retaliation. That tells you something about the level of concern inside the party, and it aligns with public opinion. Polls consistently show that Americans are deeply skeptical of new foreign military interventions. They do not want another war. They do not want U.S. troops deployed into Latin America. They do not want the United States trying to run other countries. Those concerns are not limited to Democrats. Republican voters share them too. The 5 Republicans who broke with Trump were responding to what they were hearing back home. They were responding to constituents who are tired of endless conflicts and unchecked executive power. Trump's meltdown reveals how rattled he is by that reality. If Trump were confident in his position, he would not have reacted this way. He would not have attacked senators from his own party. He would not have threatened their political futures. He would have brushed it off and moved on. Instead, he went nuclear. The emergency pressure campaign underscores that fear. A sitting president should not need to twist arms and deploy the vice president just to survive a vote within his own party. The fact that Trump barely scraped by with a tiebreaker shows how thin his margin really is. And the implications going forward are serious. Paul, Collins, and Murkowski stood firm through 2 votes. They did not fold. Their careers did not end. That sends a powerful message to other Republicans who may be uneasy about Trump's actions. It shows that breaking with Trump is survivable. If Democrats gain even 1 or 2 Senate seats in the 2026 midterms, Trump's margin disappears entirely. Suddenly, he doesn't need 5 Republican defectors to lose a vote. He might only need 2. And based on this episode, Democrats already know exactly which Republicans are willing to cross the aisle. That means Trump's second-term agenda is far more vulnerable than it appears. War powers, emergency declarations, controversial appointments, major legislative priorities, all of it becomes harder to push through when Republican unity is no longer guaranteed. Trump's decision to publicly attack the 5 Republicans may also backfire in a very real way. Senators who have been threatened and humiliated have little incentive to help him later. When Trump needs their votes on future issues, they may remember this moment. That is what weakness looks like. Not opposition from the other party, but fractures within your own. This episode should worry Trump deeply because it exposes how fragile his position really is. Venezuela is not going away as a political issue. The operation remains unpopular. It is expensive. And if American troops are injured or killed, public opinion will turn sharply against it. Every time Venezuela comes up, Democrats can point to the Senate vote and say, a bipartisan majority wanted to stop this. Trump barely escaped accountability. That is a powerful campaign message heading into 2026. Democrats can argue that the only thing standing between Trump and real limits on his power is a razor-thin margin and a vice presidential tiebreaker. If voters flip a few Senate seats, those limits become reality. Republicans know this too, and now they know something else. They know that defying Trump is possible. Paul, Collins, and Murkowski did it twice. They are still standing. That emboldens others. The next time Trump overreaches, whether it's another military action, an abuse of emergency powers, or a constitutional violation, more Republicans may decide to join them. Trump cannot afford that. His margin is too thin. His coalition is too fragile. 1 or 2 more defections and he starts losing votes outright. And the more he lashes out at his own party, the more defections he risks creating. There is also the issue of trust. Trump publicly attacked senators he may need in the future. He questioned their loyalty. He threatened their careers. That poisons relationships that matter in a closely divided Senate. Politics is transactional. When you burn bridges, you pay a price later. This entire episode revealed something Trump does not want voters to see, that his power depends on constant pressure, constant threats, and constant brinkmanship. That is not strength. That is instability. The Senate voted against Trump on Venezuela. Trump lost his composure. He barely survived the final vote, and in the process, he exposed just how close he is to losing control of his own party. This was not just a vote about foreign policy. It was a warning sign, a signal that Republican unity is fracturing, that Trump's threats are losing their effectiveness, that the margins propping up his authority are razor thin. November 2026 is coming. And based on what we saw in this vote, Trump should be very worried. Right now, he is surviving on tiebreakers and emergency pressure campaigns. That is not sustainable. That is not confidence. That is not leadership. That is weakness. And everyone watching, lawmakers, voters, and political opponents alike, can see it clearly now.